Thank you, Sonali, and thank you everyone for coming. So we have two phenomenal figures here in the area of science policy and communication. Dr. Ali Nouri, he is actually a MolBio alumni from Princeton here, I think 2006. Yes, he is currently leading the Office of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs as an Assistant Secretary at the DOE, and he previously served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in that office as well. Prior to joining the Biden administration, Dr. Nouri, he was the president of the Federation of American Scientists, which is a public policy organization that's focused on things like countering WMDs, emerging infectious diseases, very topical, as well as crafting new solutions to innovation and energy challenges. So thank you, Dr. Nouri, for being here. We also have with us Dr. Roger Aines. You might have heard his wife speak earlier today. She did an awesome chat on science communication. He is the chief scientist of the energy program at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and co-author of the book Championing Science that Sonali mentioned, Communicating Your Ideas to Decision Makers. And he has his PhD in geochemistry from Caltech, and is currently leading the Carbon Initiative at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is focused on understanding, developing, and implementing technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the air. And he's been at Lawrence Livermore since 1984, and in that time has had his hands in so many different things, just to name a couple, and I'm sure he will elaborate beyond this. He's been involved in nuclear waste disposal, environmental remediation, managing carbon emissions, particularly with methods of sequestering. And he also recently was communicating and advising California policymakers on their Getting to Neutral report. So thank you both for being here today. Really excited to chat with you.
Thank you, Shannon.
So the first thing that I want to talk to you guys about and ask is, having trained scientists inform policy decisions. That's important. That's a good thing for society. I think we can agree on that. But it's also a possibility that a lot of us, at least when we start our PhDs, and honestly throughout a lot of our PhDs, don't really know is a possibility. So for people that are in the room and on the webinar who maybe are scientists who want to be involved somehow in policy but really aren't sure what that looks like, can you talk about just some of the different ways that scientists can impact policy and what advice you might give those people?
So first of all, I want to mention that there's a couple of great ways that students can engage in policy right away. One of the ones that I really want to highlight is the AAAS Fellows Program. They pay you for a year to come to Washington to work directly with policymakers in agencies, with Congress. And if you're just saying, well, I'm not sure, is this something I want to do? Great program to look into. And I guarantee you leave with a PhD at Princeton, your resume is going to get looked at for a job like that. That, though, speaks to one of the problems is that most students don't really know what policy making is. And so they think about influencing policy and they tend to think very broadly. They think, oh, if we had a carbon tax, everything would be better. And that's too broad. You need to think about things that individuals can do and how your science informs that choice that a legislator or a department head or a regulator has to make. And that's the thing where you really have to dig in and say, well, what questions is that person asking? What kind of things are they saying about this? How is the science that I do being reflected in a policymaker's statements?
Great points, and it's really intimidating to go after you since you literally wrote the book on this topic.
You will be signing it too.
Right, I became an author today too, that's right. Well, great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and Roger, I'm really glad you led with the AAAS example. That's how I got my start after Princeton. I
didn't know that.
I became a AAAS fellow, and it's a great opportunity to take your science and technology expertise to government. And those issues are really more needed and more relevant today than ever before. I mean, when you look at the range of issues that policymakers are looking at, they stem from dealing with the climate crisis, to how do we move forward responsibly with artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. There are just so many S&T related issues, and that expertise isn't necessarily always in those offices and in the federal government. And so we really need more scientific-minded folks to come and really work on these issues and help us do these issues. And Shannon, just to get back to your question on how do we talk about science and technology to policymakers or to the public? I was just sitting upstairs. This is the Frick building. I was having a cup of coffee, and it was so wonderful to see graduate students interacting with their professors around various chemistry issues. And they were talking about battery chemistries. They were talking about material science related issues. And those are really important conversations, right, that we need to have in the science sector with fellow scientists who can follow and understand and contribute to that conversation, because they're oftentimes working at a very technical level on a similar type of thing. But I think when you take that conversation to the policy world, to the public, it becomes somewhat of a different conversation, right? There you're really thinking about, okay, how do I communicate to someone and make this information relevant to their lives, right? So the scientists, that are upstairs in this building are going to revolutionize everything, right? We need these new chemistries to build these batteries that are going to change our transportation sector, reduce emissions from that transportation sector. They're going to make energy cheaper for the public, and they're going to enable a whole new manufacturing industrial base in the United States to bring back those jobs and make those technologies here, right? So I think the more we think about how does my research connect with what folks out there are thinking about around the kitchen table, the more successful we can be in making sure the R&D ecosystem is both supported and valued through society.
One of the things that Amy and I learned when we were doing research for our book, we spent a lot of time with congressional staff. And the message we heard over and over again is legislators want to know what's in your head. After you talk to them, they don't know. They will say, thank you. They will say, great, we understand. They don't. But they want to. They really do. And so it's on us to make sure that we transmit that information. It's not on them to try and absorb it, as if, those of you who sit in this room and take a class and the professor's up here teaching with a fire hose. You cannot do that with a policymaker. It's up to you to try and understand how to make it accessible to them.
Yeah, so it kind of leads into something I really want to focus on. A big theme here is science communication, and most of us in the room are grad students, and all of us in the room, a lot of the times when we're talking about our science, it's to people who are in our field. And that's a really different experience from talking to the public or to policymakers like you guys frequently do, especially in cases where the stakes are high, like in policy decisions. So can you talk through can you go a bit into how do you distill that message? How do you convey these ideas to these policymakers, these people outside of your field, and what takeaways are there in terms of for the people in this room and how you've honed that skill?
Two responses to that. First, Amy and I talk about a thing called extracting the essence. What is the important thing about your science that you want this person to remember after your 10-minute conversation with them, if you're lucky, 10 minutes. So you have to have a thing that you want them to remember, and that thing has to be simple. We talk about extracting the essence in opposition to the idea of dumbing it down. If you're thinking you're dumbing it down, you've already insulted the audience. You've got to think, what is the part of this that I want them to take away with that fits into their world? And believe me, most policymakers are not hardcore scientists. So you need to not approach it as if they were. The second thing is to make sure that you're using language that they understand. Language is so important. And all of us have been trained And we end up with a thing in our brains. You heard Amy talk about paradigm. Our brains change as we study our field. And the way you think about things changes. I think about geology in very different ways than any of you do because I've been trained in it for so many years. I can't let that slip into the conversation with a policymaker. I need to recognize that he's probably a lawyer. And he has a very different view of the world. To him, rocks are some things that are in the way of his car. Okay, so you have to put yourself in the position of the policymaker.
I would just echo everything Roger said. I think it's really important to identify what the folks you're speaking with value and really speaking to those values and to those interests. When I was here at Princeton, I was a graduate student in the molecular biology department, and I was working on fruit flies. I was tinkering with genes of fruit flies. Now, how can that possibly be interesting to a wider set of audiences? But it turned out the professor that I was working with ended up identifying a bunch of genes that are operating in one way in the fruit fly, but the same genes are the ones that get mutated in human cancers, colon cancers in particular. And about 5 or 6 years ago, there were actually companies that developed drugs based on, in part, his research in fruit flies back in the 1980s to treat people with human colon cancer. So it's translating the value of the basic research and really walking people through the various steps of it, from the lab to the company, to the patent, to the company, and ultimately to the product, and really thinking through, well, what are all the areas within this pipeline that we need the federal government involved to try to facilitate this transfer of knowledge and to the field where you can actually see improvement in people's lives. I think the more we think about it in those kinds of terms, the more it really resonates with folks and wants them to get involved in the story and in solving the various challenges that we experience along that path.
You're probably all thinking, wow, how do you do that? How do you find that kind of information? How do you engage at that level? And the answer is, there are staff in these people's offices whose job it is to help you answer those questions. And some of them are AAAS fellows. But you can always find out what policymakers are interested in by going to the staff that support them, by going to people who talk with them, and get a sense of what matters to them before you walk in and give them your giant bolus of information that doesn't reflect anything that they care about. You need to find out, what are they really worried about? What have they said in public? What do they say to their constituents? And what bills are they, if they're legislators, what bills are they supporting? And then you're going to get a sense of where their head is, what they're thinking about. And rather than thinking, I'm going to convince you of something, you should walk in thinking, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you provide some information. And by the way, that comes back to another thing. You will occasionally, in this conversation, get asked a question. The answer needs to be provided almost instantaneously. These people's worlds is not 2 weeks from now, not perfect. It's like, this afternoon. Can you tell me this number this afternoon? So, that's how to think about interacting with policymakers. But I'm in the midst of someone who does this every day, so I want to get your reflection on that.
You're 100% right. And what you said that really resonated with me was, it's not always about, especially if you're going to Congress to meet with a member of Congress or their staff, it doesn't always have to be about what they can do for you, but what you can do for them. Because that's really how you build lasting relationships with these offices. Oftentimes, as scientists, we have fly-in days where a bunch of scientists go to Congress to advocate for more R&D funding or something related to the S&T endeavor. They show up, they do the 30-minute meetings with the various staffers, and then they leave. You don't see them again, and then they come back 6 months later, right? On the other hand, there are people who are consistently engaging these offices and building relationships and formulating relationships with staff. And when I was a staffer in Congress, what I found was that the farmers were some of the best advocates for their profession. You don't necessarily think about farmers as the most sophisticated, congressionally minded. I mean, they are sophisticated, but you don't necessarily think about them in the sophistication that you need to work a congressional office. But because they recognize that the work of Congress is so important to their lives and their livelihoods, they maintain these strong relationships with us. And they knew us by name, they knew things about our family, they consistently engaged with us. And when it came to writing the Farm Bill, which Congress does every 5 years, guess who those members look to for advice to put in that bill? It's those very farmers that they have those relationships with. So that's just a model that I think we could replicate in the science community.
Yeah. So I kind of want to sit on that for a little bit. You guys are both saying kind of a similar thing. Roger, you used the phrase extracting the essence to kind of describe that general idea. I imagine that's something that is kind of probably comes easier over time.
No,
you guys have had a bit
easy.
of time to work on it. So can you talk a little bit about how you honed that skill, or are there certain times where you tried to do this and it's like, I didn't really convey that super well, and what you were able to learn from it?
There's a phrase that we heard from a White House staffer when we were writing our book that really resonates with me here, and that is self-aware and self-correcting. You need to pay attention to whether people are getting your message, and you need to keep changing it and improving it and looking at people in the eye and seeing if they're getting it. And unfortunately, you can't say, do you understand? If you ask a congressman, then they will always say yes. But this idea that it's on you to continuously improve is something you need to think about all the time. Just like you improve your science, you need to improve the way that you talk about it so that people can understand it.
Yeah, and for me, it's an ongoing issue, right? It's something you work on all the time. And initially, when you switch from a highly technical field, like whether you're a PhD student in the sciences or in the social sciences, to one where you really have to become more of a generalist, which is really what you need to do if you're going from science to public policy, you really need to change the way that you communicate ideas to your audience, right? I certainly had to struggle with that at the beginning, because you're going from a very, very technical area where you're a mile deep to one that you're an inch deep, right? And that's the first thing. The second thing is that your audience, the policymaker, whether it's a senator or currently where I report to the Secretary of Energy, these are people with a huge amount of workload every day that's on their mind, right? They have to keep up with everything that's going on, and they don't necessarily have time to sit through a 1-hour seminar the way we used to do as scientists. So oftentimes you have to get to the point very quickly, and that's where the acronym BLUF is really important. If you've heard it before, bottom line up front, right? You want to give them the bottom line. You want to let them know why this is important today, this very minute, and then a couple recommendations as to what they might want to do with that information. And that's a different skill set that we practice in science, and it's something that I'm continually thinking about and trying to improve on.
When you walk into a room with Princeton on your resume, you don't have to justify every scientific statement you make the same way you would at the American Chemical Society meeting. They're going to take your word for almost everything you say. So the idea that you're going to build the scientific case to somebody like this is a waste of time. You shouldn't do that. That puts the onus on you to be very careful about what you say, but still what they want to know is what's important, what's in your head, maybe why do you think it, but they want to get at what's in your head, not how it got there.
So I think probably one of the reasons that it's really difficult for scientists is that science, especially when you're the one doing it and you're familiar with all the details, it's got a lot of context and nuance and caveats. And those are things that probably the decision makers are less, need to be filtered out when you're distilling the essence. And what would you say to people in the audience who are kind of struggling to package their message at, in terms of worrying about losing some of that context and maybe portraying something that's not entirely accurate?
I find that your choice of words is really important. If you say, it's known that, you have encumbered the opinions of a lot of people who are not in the room, and you better be awfully careful of that. But if you say, I have studied this and I have found that, that's an entirely different message, one that you can be a little broader, a little more inclusive, especially when that sentence is followed by, I have found that the most important thing or an important thing that we need to consider is X. That's a great thing for a policymaker. The second thing to think about is it's very tempting. I see people do this all the time. They want to walk in and tell policymakers what they should do. Guess what? We're not good at policy. He is, but we're good at science. So I try to be really careful to say could and not should. These are things that you could do. If you did this, this is what I believe the outcome would be. I have not locked myself into the entire discipline. I've not locked myself into the fact that I could be easily wrong. It's today, okay? I think of what happened during the pandemic. But that's how I think about avoiding the trap of the academic talk where you're expected to be perfect in everything that you say.
Yeah.
That's really good advice. And the one thing I would add to it is in science, it's mostly about the research, right? And to the extent where people are involved, it's about collaborating with people or presenting your results to people. Mm-hmm. But it's not the type of thing where, in public policy, on the other hand, where you need to not just have the science aspects of the policy, but you also need the coalitions and the people, right? Those are the folks that ultimately are going to determine whether or not whatever science policy you're pursuing is going to be successful or not. So for example, look at the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress passed last year and the president signed into law. Our nation's largest climate investments in history, in fact, bigger than any country's climate investments. And in part, this came about because the science and technology has reached a point where we can actually envision this energy transition. The cost of solar has come down 90% over the last 10 years, which means we can actually deploy clean energy at a scale and meet those climate goals that wasn't possible to do 10 years ago. But that wasn't enough. The other piece of it was all the people, all the coalitions, the environmental justice advocacy groups, all those groups that came together and urged Congress to move forward with this legislation. These two things really go hand in hand together. And so that's a long way of saying, back to your question, Shannon, how do you describe all the nuances of a public policy issue in a one-page memo or in a 2-minute conversation? I think part of it is making the audience aware of the various constituencies and the dynamics that are out there so that they know if they move forward with a policy who's going to be supportive and who's not. You want to remove that element of surprise, and to the extent where you can bring in that human factor, it helps to do that.
And you may find that your time in front of the policymaker is nowhere near as important as your colleagues' time, your friends' time, the steelworkers union's time. It's the coalition of like-minded people who can influence the direction that policy moves. It's not one individual, no matter how smart they are. Occasionally that happens, but most of the time it's a coalition of people who say, in general, this is where we want to be, this is what we're capable of, this is what the nation would be proud of. And that's not just you, that's a lot of other people.
So I want to focus in now. You bring up a lot of good points, and this kind of leads into it. I want to focus in a bit more on like the climate and energy lens of what you guys do, because you guys, in your work with science policy, you're having to talk to people across the spectrum, and the way that we respond to climate change is something that can still be a bit controversial. So for you to be effective at your job, you need to be able to communicate with people who, before you even walk in a room, might disagree with you or have hesitations or preconceptions about what you're going to say. How do you handle those conversations so that you can be an effective advocate to people of a lot of different ideas?
The first thing is try to understand your audience before you walk in. Try to know what matters to them. And Katharine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist, an evangelical Christian, a Canadian who works at Texas Tech. Does that cover enough ground? She talks about the fact that everyone has a connection at some point with everyone else. Try to start at that connection point so that you don't walk in an argument, but rather in a, we both care about this thing. We care about jobs, or we care about water quality, or we care about, schools, whatever it is. Try to start there. Second thing is to recognize my world, climate change, is nowhere near as controversial as the newspapers would like you to believe. Most of the country firmly believes that it's a problem. They believe we have to act. They believe that science is correct. There's a very small number of people who are getting a lot of press by saying otherwise. So you don't have to immediately today think you're going to walk into a fight. Now, maybe in a few congressmen's offices you would, but most people you don't have to. And so, don't spend a lot of time defending when you're actually facing a friend.
Yeah, going back to what Roger said about meeting people where they are, I think that's just super important. And again, the example I have here is going back to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a climate bill, but it's also a clean energy deployment bill. It's also a bill that's going to reduce energy prices, and it's a bill that's going to create jobs, right? And different segments of the population might be more interested in certain areas of those. There are the climate hawks, climate champions, who are really excited by the fact that this bill is going to reduce emissions in the United States by 40% by the year 2030. That's the thing that gets them really excited. But at the same time, if you're interested in lower energy bills, which is everyone, well, this bill has tremendous incentives in the form of rebates and tax credits for you to replace your inefficient appliances in your homes with more efficient ones, for you to replace your internal combustion vehicle with a battery or a hydrogen or a zero-emission vehicle. It's got incentives to reduce emissions from the industrial sector. So point being, those arguments when it comes to lower energy costs and job creation are ones that everyone agrees with, right? People are really excited that we are bringing back manufacturing jobs in the solar supply chain, in the battery supply chain to the United States. In the last 2 years alone, there have been $90 billion worth of announcements for manufacturing facilities. These are going into communities that have been hollowed out, that have lost those jobs, and now we're seeing those jobs come back. So even if you're not interested in the fact that the bill reduces emissions by 40% by the year 2030, who's not going to be excited over manufacturing coming back, right? So the broader we can talk about these issues, the wider the audiences we can reach.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. So something, we recently just went through a pandemic, which was a really eye-opening time to be a scientist, I think, because, we saw evolving science, policy decisions, and misinformation all playing out in real time very publicly. So has watching that transpired impacted the way that you guys approach your roles with relation to energy and the environment at all? And what takeaways do you think we can translate from that sort of public health policy observation that we went through to what else, other areas that we're doing?
I'm just going to
start.
I just piggyback on your responses.
I have a cautionary note on that. One of the things that happens at a time of crisis is that we tend to think we're smarter than we are. You've got to be awfully careful with the uncertainties, the unknown unknowns. We all know about those. And we need to be careful that the advice that we give is appropriate for the circumstance. And that can be a real challenge when it hits the fan. So, my advice to all of you, my ask for all of you in your specialties is to think, what's going to happen in the future that I'm going to be asked about so that I can be prepared and give a rationed response, one that isn't done at the heat of, oh my God, there's 10,000 people dying every day. That's not a time to be thinking clearly. So you all have specialties, you all have things you're doing. Think about what is going to happen in the future and then be prepared to respond rationally. And when the heat of the moment comes up, remember that, like, maybe I shouldn't be making a knee-jerk response to this. Maybe I should be careful. In the Special Forces, they have a saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I really like that.
Yeah, and that speaks to Shannon's question on misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think part of it is just also recognizing that we're all susceptible to misinformation. It's not necessarily unique to a certain sector or a certain political ideology. There is just so much information around, and especially in a time of the pandemic where we're early days in that fog of war, and to your point, Roger, in the science community, there's the National Academy of Science process, right? Which when there is a large scientific question that needs to be addressed, and science sort of needs to speak on behalf of the issue, the National Academies takes oftentimes a 12-month process where these scientists get together and they really think through the issue and they publish a report that informs the debate, but that report, guess what, came 12 months after the fact. When you have a pandemic that has a reproduction number of 3 and is spreading exponentially, you don't always have time for that, right? And that's where we fall into the misinformation trap, and it becomes really important to be able to identify the fact from fiction. And I think part of the way we can go about doing this is to look at who is pushing the information and what their incentives are for saying what they're saying. And this also applies in the public policy arena. My first boss, when I was a staffer in the Senate, we used to have folks coming in to lobby on all kinds of things, and his first question would always be, who is paying them, right? Because that can often determine what is it that they're pushing. Back in the 50s, the tobacco folks knew that tobacco causes cancer, right? But they put out a different kind of narrative. Similarly, many in the fossil fuel industry knew about climate impacts, but they also happen to fund anti-climate groups. So just looking at where the funding is and what the incentives are helps to elucidate some of that.
And imagining that just because you're at a university, you're not subject to that is not true. I see people who come in with a specific answer that they're pushing at the expense of other answers as just as dangerous as somebody who's being paid under the table to do something illicit. We have to be careful of that. We have to remember that our answer is part of a context, part of a larger solution, and we don't want to be, we want to be careful of our allies and our friends, not get into a fight with them.
Yeah, so before we open it up to the audience to ask questions, I have one more question I want to ask you guys, and I did get this from a podcast I listened to, but if you guys were able to change one thing, anything about the current state of science policy, what would you change?
I would change the fact that almost all of the decisions that we make about climate today use money as the measurement factor. We have the lowest cost energy system today. We're not that happy with it. Scientists get sucked into this because it's an easy metric. We can say we can build a model. For heaven's sake, the UN models on what we're going to do in the future are all based upon how much money gets spent. And we won't necessarily get the outcomes that we want. I would point to biodiversity as something that's very hard to quantify in terms of money. I would like to see a broader conversation that basically said, what kind of world do we want to have in the future, and how are we going to get there?
Great. I would add that for me, one of the really interesting areas in science policy right now are the role of emerging technologies. More and more we're seeing these amazing advances on everything from biotechnology to artificial intelligence to quantum sciences, and these are all technologies that are going to be shaping the future, right? And shaping these industries of the future that we're going to be building. And they have huge policy ramifications behind them. What are the applications of artificial intelligence that we should be concerned about? I mean, certainly we want to grow that sector, but we also want to grow it in a way that addresses some of those risks, right, associated with the technology. We want to make sure that automation doesn't put vast amounts of people out of work. We want to make sure that those algorithms are not getting kids addicted to TikTok, right? Those are technological conversations, not entirely, but to some extent, where we need to be thinking about building technical safeguards into these technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or whether it's biotechnology, which is an amazing technology, right? That you can use it to build biofuels and medicine and biomaterials, but if you're a bad actor, you could also use that biotechnology ecosystem to produce bioweapons, or you could produce bacteria that are going to attack biofuels. So these are the areas where we're just not spending enough time thinking about. And I think scientists, technologists, engineers have a really important role to play in this conversation, because the science moves fast, the policy does not move as fast to catch up. And for that, we need all of you and your expertise to weigh into these issues.
Awesome. So at this point, we will open up the questions. So anything you guys might have in the audience.
All right, I'm going to run around and pass the mic. And I wasn't kidding. I do have signed copies of the books. And I see a lot of hands. So fun.
Hi, thanks so much for a really interesting talk. My question is about how to convey scientific uncertainty to policymakers. My research is on large-scale geospatial analyses of coral reefs and their conservation, and it's something I struggle with a lot, how best to couch my language in the right amount of scientific uncertainty without taking away all its conclusions. I think scientists have an implicit understanding of how science is conducted and the uncertainty behind it, but oftentimes that can be lost in translation when talking between disciplines. I was wondering if you guys had any tips and tricks for that.
That's the thing where language really matters. That you can't put error bars on a conversation with a congressperson, a member of Congress, I'm sorry, I'll get that phrasing right. You need to be able to convey uncertainty in more subtle ways, and highlighting what you think, first of all, is one way to avoid that. Highlighting what appears to be the most important thing is another way to highlight that. But it's also really important to say, we don't know. This is one that we need to work on, sir. We need to figure this out, and this is what we need to do to get there. Remember that resolving that uncertainty allows people to act, and that's one of the functions of science.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, as a scientist, what a great question. As a scientist, your currency is your credibility, right? And I think we have to be transparent and we have to be honest. And if we don't know something, we have to say we don't know it. Otherwise, we'll get into a lot of trouble. And I think we saw some of this during the COVID-19 pandemic. Early on, there was a dispute as to whether or not the virus is airborne or whether the virus is spreading through touch and very short distances. I think instead of recognizing that ambiguity and the fact that we didn't know, there was a tendency on the part of some to rule out that airborne route because it was unusual for this kind of virus. And so in order to both reassure the public, we just didn't talk about the uncertainty of how this virus is traveling in the way that we should have. Similarly, later on in the pandemic, when it appeared that people are getting reinfected by the virus, so whether they've had a prior infection, they can get reinfected, or even folks that were vaccinated could get infected. I think people didn't quite embrace that phenomenon as early as they should have. And part of it, I think, was because folks were, again, concerned that they might cause a panic or they might give the wrong impression that the vaccines are not effective, even though the vaccines are very effective. They may not stop infection, but they do certainly significantly reduce the severity of the disease. But because it becomes difficult to talk about those nuances and those caveats, there was a tendency to simplify things. And we should have just as a community been more straightforward with those nuances. And because perhaps we weren't in the same degree that we should have been, I think we did see some folks lose their trust in the science. And that's really too bad because, I mean, if you look at the pandemic, it is the advances in science and technology, the decades of work in virology that resulted in this rapid advancement in the vaccine development, right? So we did really well on the actual technical side, but we could have been better on the communication side.
Hi, I'm Keely Swan. I'm the assistant director at CPRI over at the Policy School.
And Apple sponsor
Thanks. And so my question, Ali, a lot of the questions that you started to raise at the end here have this policy orientation to them. They're not just the scientific questions that students are asking. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience here at Princeton, how you started to hone those skills and start to get exposed to more policy while you were here at Princeton. And then, Roger, if you wanted to also contribute on how you started to expand from the scientific research into more policy work. Thanks.
Great. I'll go first this time.
Please.
Thank you for the question. So I was a graduate student here at Princeton, and it was in the early 2000s. And I was merrily going about my business, working in the lab, tinkering with Drosophila melanogaster genetics. And then the administration at the time, the George Bush administration, decided that they wanted to go to war with Iraq. And this was really a shocking thing, not just for me, but for lots of people who were watching the foreign policy and national security debate closely. And I just I was just kind of, dumbfounded and frustrated that this great nation could embark on such a poor decision. And I wanted to understand what are the forces in the policy sphere that result in something like this. And fortunately for me, and this is such a great place to be a graduate student in this sense, I could walk out of the lab and go to the School of Public Policy and watch someone give a lecture on those very topics. And through that process, I got to know the program on science and global security, which is part of the public policy school. And there were professors there who had been physicists working on nuclear non-proliferation. So they were folks that were marrying the science side with the policy side. And one of those professors, who's still here, Chris Chaiba, invited me to join his team because he was really interested in how can we safeguard the biology space from being misused toward biological weapons. And so he was looking for someone with a technical background. So that was my transition from the academic side of things to the policy side. And then through those individuals, I was able to get other opportunities to do the AAAS fellowship, work at the United Nations. And the big takeaway for me in that process was really keep your eyes and ears open, be very flexible with respect to how your technical expertise can support something in public policy. That flexibility and adaptability will really open up a lot of doors for you. And then the last thing I would say is these relationships that you're building with your mentors are going to be critical because you will need their help to get your next job. I am still benefiting from the relationships that I built with my mentors when I was here at Princeton, when it comes to finding a new job or when it comes to finding a challenge that I'm experiencing in a job. I still go back to these people. And so the fact that you're here and you have the opportunity to foster those relationships is something I'd really encourage you to take advantage of.
I can't build on that.
Thank you so much. So like actually all the other folks who have already asked questions, I'm affiliated with SPIA, the policy school, and I work on U.S. climate adaptation and climate justice policy. And in this area of research, I specifically do qualitative research, and it can be very slow and deliberative, and value is placed on kind of co-production between policymakers and community members and researchers. And so there's a goal of like going to policymakers and asking, what research do you want to see and how do we build up trust with you? But I think that that is often too open-ended of a question and very hard as an approach, but it's sort of like what my area of research values. So I'm wondering if you could speak to like how to deal with that tension of trying to design research projects collectively.
Most policymakers already have opinions about what their goals are in climate. I mean, this is my world. I see this all the time. They have a thing that, or several things that they care about in the climate world. And so your question to them becomes, what keeps you from accomplishing that? What do you think is missing from the conversation? But anybody who's going to be a useful person for you to spend time with already has opinions. So what you want to do is draw them out. Find out what they're thinking, why they're thinking it, and how you can support their thought process.
I would say the exact same thing. Find out what their interests are, and speak to those interests. So, for example, if you're talking to a member of Congress, well, members of Congress really care about what their constituencies think back in their districts and back in their states, right? So, to the extent where you're working on climate resiliency, and you can reach out to those communities, get them interested, get them excited with your research portfolio, go visit that member of Congress, but take those folks from their districts with you. And that way they can really reinforce what you're trying to achieve.
Hi, I'm Anirudh Mohan. I'm a postdoc in the Andlinger Center. I work on decarbonization of energy systems. I'm curious about the mental model that policymakers and their staff have when evaluating scientists, right? So I have a certain mental model in my field to say, okay, you publish in so-and-so journals, like, I'm not really going by the name of the university because there are certain people at my field who might be at Stanford and might still be, not be really accurate in what they say. So it's more about the type
no
of
one at
work.
Stanford, no.
Yeah, I won't name any names, but so I have a certain mental model when I'm evaluating fellow scientists. How do policymakers and their staff do that? Is it the person who's shouting the loudest? Is it the person who your staffer follows on Twitter? Is it the person who was proactive in reaching out to you? How do you sort of get on the map of these people?
We recently had the experience in California of trying to figure out how we were going to get to net zero well ahead of the conversation really anywhere else. The first jurisdiction that had a plan to get to net zero. And this began about 6 years ago with a serious intent, and just before the current governor took on, the state took on the aspiration of net zero, and now we have laws for net zero. But the way we approach that is to say, what's missing? What tools do we not have? How can we increase the state's ability to reach those goals? And yet there are people out there saying, we can do it all with our magical unicorn. And you'd be amazed how clear it is to legislators that that's what's being told to them. But if you go in and you say, somebody else has the right idea. If I walk in and I say, Jesse Jenkins is the guy you want to talk to about this, I get double credibility and he gets triple credibility. It's an art of saying, I'm not actually the smartest person in this room right now, but I know who you need to talk to. And that is magical.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to making sure that your advice is relevant and salient to whatever issue it is that they are grappling with in that moment, that day, that week. Speaking of Jesse Jenkins, the Princeton lab that provided that modeling work was very successful with Congress, because Congress was developing the Inflation Reduction Act. And it was one of those bills where they really tried to incentivize the right set of policies in order to meet the emission reduction targets. And so having a group like Jesse Jenkins's group that could model those policies in real time and provide the kind of feedback that Congress was looking for was super instrumental in having the right set of data to push that policy. But again, that's just one example. It really comes down to identifying where your advice can be relevant to someone and communicate it in an effective way where they can really act on it. These offices don't look at the number of publications, right? They don't look at the science citations. It's really they're looking to build relationships with folks that they can trust and who will give them unfiltered, relevant advice.
Hi, my name is Mansha. I am in the same lab as Shannon. Hey, Shannon. Great discussion. 2 questions, completely unrelated, but hopefully will be answered. It's great. I want to take a step back from everything that everyone has asked. It almost seems that people are way ahead in asking you specific questions on what they're talking to about policymakers. But to take a step back even further, basic, how do you suggest scientists, young scientists, most of us are very passionate about what we do, start the conversation about energy, climate change, what we feel about, and how do policymakers anticipate this conversation to start in the first place, right? What do you suggest scientists like us? We are very happy in our silos, in our labs, doing discovery-based science, but passionate about saving the planet. So that's my first question. The second question is something just off the bat. Few hours ago, news where Ford decides that Ford is putting in $4.5 billion towards production of EV vehicles over the next few years. Volkswagen, on the other hand, is putting in 180 billion euros. So how is the US competing with these forward-looking companies and forward-looking markets? And how are you incentivizing the United States to also emerge as a leader in clean energy?
Let me go. Great. Two great questions on how can I talk to policymakers and where do I start? I think it's a couple things. One, you can look at the societal ramifications, implications of what you're doing. And then you have to match that up with which policymaker might be interested in that area. So if you're working on something related to battery chemistry of batteries, for example, you might want to focus on the Department of Energy. If you're working on how to develop compounds and analogs that will treat that huge fentanyl crisis that we're facing as a country. Well, there are lots of members of Congress that are really focused and interested and are trying to solve the fentanyl challenges, and they would love to hear from you, to the extent where your research can translate into a societal need that they're trying to solve. So that's the first thing I would say. Second, it always helps to reach out to, especially if you're working with Congress, to members of Congress from your home district, because constituents just have a much preferential sort of way of getting meetings and establishing those relationships with those home state senators and members of Congress. So it's a good entry point to start there. And then once you start having those conversations with your own local representatives, you will meet staffers who will connect you with others. They may identify other policies that are happening elsewhere in the Senate or in the House, where another member might really benefit from the kind of insight that you bring to the table. That's one area, and then the second area is, there are associations, right? There is the American Lung Association for healthcare. There is the Biofuels Association for folks that are working on biofuels, and these associations are these large umbrella organizations whose members are from academia, are from industry. And these associations have very good connections to policymakers, and they really understand the landscape. So to the extent where you can identify who that association might be for you. And in the science world, of course, we also have those associations, AAAS, American Society for Microbiology, so on and so forth. They can do some of the navigating for you and get you in front of the audiences that you need to be in front of. On your last, and I'm sorry, I'm long-winded here.
Let me respond to that one before we go to the last question. That's going to change the subject a lot. I don't know what you do. Well, I guess I know what Shannon does. But your professional society has an arm that does this. Every professional society does. They go from small things to large scale. The American Meteorological Society runs a boot camp every summer and teaching people how to do this that is awesome. And if you want to commit 2 weeks or a month of your time in a summer sometime to doing this, you're going to be immediately part of the conversation. So the professional societies recognize that that's one of their important roles, is to transmit their science to policymakers.
So we're already over 4, and I promised them questions. So quick questions, quick answers, them and them. Let's go.
So much is okay. Yeah. My question is just for particularly people who are still determining their research direction and questions, and how we can kind of choose research questions that will be most applicable to potential policy impacts.
So, my field is climate, and every specialty has a future in climate. But you need to be really good at it. You need to be good at something so that you can make a difference, so that when we have these conversations, you can actually be doing something useful. And you need to be general. You need to pay attention to what questions need to be answered. So I would encourage you to do what you love. Do the thing that you wake up on Saturday and you think, I want to work on this, because that's going to carry through into the rest of your career. I'm a geologist because I look around and I see a story. I don't see rocks. I love that. But I encourage you to do the same thing and get really good at it, and then it's going to apply to climate, because everything does.
This is a question probably particularly for Roger. I wanted to ask about the trade-off between policy-relevant publication and academically rewarded publication. It seems like, even to take the example that you all brought up of some of the repeat lab work, that is, that stuff that stuff comes out in white paper format, audited policymakers, takes time, takes a lot of work. Finding ways to put that into a journal, get that kind of credibility can be challenging. And that's an example of just a broader dynamic, especially for PhDs trying to establish themselves in an academic environment, get a tenure track job, things like that. How do you reconcile those two?
You can't reconcile it. You have no choice but to do the academic publications, because if you want an academic job in the future, you're going to have to do that. So these other things become side issues for you while you're a graduate student, even while you're a postdoc. But policy-relevant publications are not in Nature and Science in general. They're these white papers, they're thought pieces, they're things that are 2 or 3 pages long. It might refer to those, but think of the science papers as a foundation upon which you build policy-relevant conversations.
Okay. So I'm a graduate in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I'm interested in policy, but I also really like being in a department full of scientists. So I'm kind of wondering, do you ever miss academia or university environment? And if yes, why? And if no, why not?
I certainly do miss it. And I really enjoy coming back here and interacting with my old professors and learning about what research areas folks are pursuing. But I don't have any regrets that I switched careers. I think, for me personally, science was amazing. It was fascinating. I loved spending hours in the lab and that joy of discovery. But at the end of the day, I was more interested in policy because I could work on a broader set of issues. Right, and it's a very different type of work. It's one where you don't have that aha moment and that discovery that you have in the lab, but over time, working with people, working with coalitions, you can make real change, even though sometimes they can be slow, and then other times, like as in the Inflation Reduction Act in the last year, it can be very fast. So for me, it was a good decision.
And I would point to the fact that there are 70,000 scientists at national labs that don't have to make that decision. Academia is not the only place that important science gets done.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you, everyone. So please join us out in the atrium for their networking reception. I know there's many questions, so you guys can catch up with them. Also, special shout out to, do we have more copies of these books out there? If you didn't get a copy, you can get a copy and get it signed in real time. Yeah, and shout out to our next Grad Futures event tomorrow is going to be at 10 a.m. with Jean Tom. She is an Executive Director of Engineering Development and Chemistry Process Development at Bristol-Myers Squibb. She's also a CBE PhD alumni, so for all the CBEs in the room, I see you, shout out. Yeah, so join us there. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ali and Roger, for your time.